My name is Hale, and for a long time I thought maturity meant compromise, patience, and the quiet ability to swallow discomfort for the sake of peace. I'm 35 years old now, broad-framed with the kind of calm demeanor people often mistake for passivity, and I've always been someone who believed character showed itself through consistency rather than volume. I'm not the loudest man in a room, nor the flashiest, but I've built my life on reliability and effort. I believe those traits made me a good husband, a good partner, and a good man. It never occurred to me that the same qualities I was proud of would one day be used as evidence that I wasn't enough. Before we continue with the story, kindly support the channel by hitting the like button, share this video, subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. Professionally, I work as a senior operations analyst for a logistics firm based in Chicago, a job that demands precision, foresight, and accountability. My days are spent optimizing systems, fixing inefficiencies, and solving problems before they explode into disasters, which has shaped the way I approach life outside of work. I like structure, measurable progress, and clear communication, and I've never shied away from self-improvement when it's rooted in fairness and mutual respect. I came from a middle-class family where nothing was handed to you, and everything was earned, so growth always felt like a responsibility rather than a burden. That mindset followed me into my marriage, where I assumed effort was the same thing as love. I met my wife, Lauren Price, 8 years ago at a friend's rooftop birthday party on a humid summer evening, the kind where conversations blur together under string lights and cheap drinks. She stood out immediately, not just because she was beautiful, but because she carried herself with unmistakable confidence, the kind that makes you feel seen and evaluated at the same time. Lauren worked in brand strategy then, sharp-tongued and articulate, someone who spoke with certainty even when discussing opinions. We talked for hours that night about work, ambition, and the lives we imagined for ourselves, and when I asked for her number, she smiled as if she'd expected it all along. I mistook that certainty for strength, not realizing how easily it could turn into judgment. We dated for 3 years before getting married, years that felt productive and purposeful, filled with milestones that looked good on paper. I was 32 when we married, and Lauren was 30, both of us established enough to feel like we were making a smart, adult decision rather than a romantic gamble. She had moved into a senior consultant role by then, thriving in environments where critique and refinement were celebrated, while I had just received a promotion that solidified my long-term career path. Friends described us as a power couple, and I took pride in that label, believing it meant we pushed each other to be better. What I didn't question was who got to define what better actually meant. The shift didn't happen overnight, which is why it took me so long to see it clearly. At first, Lauren's comments sounded like encouragement wrapped in ambition, suggestions about my wardrobe, my social habits, the way I spoke in meetings or carried myself at events. She framed everything as potential, as if I were a project just one revision away from excellence. I adjusted without resistance, telling myself that marriage was about growth and alignment. When she pointed out flaws, I listened. When she compared me to others, I rationalized it as motivation. I believed love meant being open to critique, even when it came exclusively from one direction and never seemed to end. The moment that changed everything arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, without shouting or drama, which somehow made it worse. Lauren sat across from me at the dining table, her expression calm and businesslike, and slid a single sheet of paper toward me. At the top, in bold, neatly typed font, were the words, "Things you must fix to deserve me." Below it was a numbered list, detailed and exhaustive, outlining my supposed deficiencies, my earning potential, my mindset, my habits, even my emotional responses. She watched me read it like a manager awaiting feedback, convinced this was reasonable, constructive, necessary. In that moment, something quiet but unbreakable shifted inside me. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't tear the paper in half, though both impulses flashed briefly through my mind. Instead, I folded the list carefully, placed it back on the table, and looked at the woman I had married, realizing that love should never sound like a performance review with conditional acceptance. She expected compliance, maybe gratitude, perhaps even relief that she had finally clarified my shortcomings. What she didn't expect was that I would take her list seriously, but not in the way she imagined. As I sat there, meeting her confident gaze, I understood that this wasn't about fixing myself to deserve her. It was about deciding whether anyone who loved me would ever need such a list in the first place. That night, after Lauren handed me the list and went to bed as if she'd just completed a routine task, I stayed at the table long after the apartment went quiet. I unfolded the paper again, slower this time, forcing myself to read every line without defensiveness or denial. Each item was written with unsettling clarity, bullet points broken into subpoints, timelines suggested, outcomes implied. It wasn't emotional or messy, it was strategic. She wanted me to earn her approval through measurable change, as if marriage were a probationary contract and she was the final authority. I realized then that this wasn't the first time I'd been evaluated like this, it was simply the first time she'd documented it. The list wasn't a sudden development, it was a summary of years of quiet assessments I had willingly participated in. As I reread the items, memories surfaced with uncomfortable precision. I remembered the time she suggested I aim higher after I declined an opportunity that would have doubled my workload with minimal long-term gain, framing my decision as fear rather than discernment. I remembered how she corrected me mid-conversation at a dinner party, smiling as she did it, later explaining she was just helping me sound sharper. I remembered the subtle sighs when I chose rest over productivity, the way she praised other men for qualities I supposedly lacked, always insisting she was motivating me, not criticizing. Back then, I had internalized those moments as necessary friction, believing that growth required discomfort. Sitting there with the list in my hands, I finally understood that discomfort had become the point, not the byproduct. The following weeks were revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated, because once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore. Lauren began referencing the list casually, as if it were a shared roadmap rather than a unilateral decree. She'd ask if I'd thought about item 3 yet, or whether I was making progress on the mindset issues she'd outlined. There was no malice in her tone, just certainty, certainty that she was right, certainty that I needed fixing, certainty that love was something to be earned through compliance. I tried, briefly, to engage in conversation about how the list made me feel, but those discussions always circled back to her disappointment that I was focusing on emotion instead of execution. In her mind, my discomfort was further proof that I lacked the resilience she expected. What unsettled me most wasn't the criticism itself, but how normalized it had become in our marriage. I began to notice how often I edited myself before speaking, how frequently I second-guessed decisions that had once come naturally to me. I caught myself measuring my worth in productivity metrics and imagined benchmarks, wondering if today's version of me would meet her standards or fall short again. The irony was that, by every external measure, I was doing well: stable career, respected professionally, healthy friendships, a solid sense of responsibility. Yet inside my own home, I felt perpetually behind, as if I were always one improvement away from being fully accepted. That realization hit harder than any insult ever could. One evening, after another calm but one-sided conversation about my progress, I asked Lauren a question that had been forming quietly in my mind for days. I asked her what she thought she needed to fix to deserve me. The room went still in a way I hadn't experienced before, her confidence faltering just slightly as she processed the idea. She laughed it off at first, saying relationships weren't about keeping score, that my question missed the point. But I pressed gently, not accusatory, just curious. I told her I was open to mutual growth, to shared accountability, to the idea that we were both evolving. The more I spoke, the more defensive she became, her tone sharpening as she insisted that she already brought her best self to the relationship. That answer told me everything I needed to know. It became clear that the list wasn't about improvement at all, it was about hierarchy. Lauren didn't see us as two people choosing each other daily, she saw herself as the standard and me as the variable. Once I understood that, something inside me began to settle, not into anger, but into certainty. I stopped trying to win arguments that were never designed to be fair. I started paying attention to how I felt when I imagined the rest of my life under constant evaluation, always proving, always adjusting, always earning. The thought exhausted me in a way no long workday ever had. For the first time since our marriage began, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I'd been avoiding, the possibility that love should never require a list, and that silence in the face of disrespect isn't maturity, but surrender. I didn't respond to Lauren's list right away, and that delay unsettled her more than any argument ever had. Silence, I learned, was the one thing she couldn't manage, because it denied her the feedback loop she relied on to feel in control. Over the next several days, she grew increasingly attentive to my behavior, watching for signs of resistance or submission, trying to gauge whether I was falling back into line or preparing to push back. I went about my routines calmly, work, gym, dinner, sleep, without referencing the list or my progress, and the normalcy seemed to irritate her. Internally, I was doing the hardest work I'd done in years, examining not just her expectations, but why I had tolerated them for so long. I realized how often I'd confused endurance with strength, believing that absorbing criticism quietly made me more evolved, when in reality it had slowly eroded my sense of self. During that week of reflection, I revisited the early days of our relationship with a new lens, noticing details I'd once dismissed as harmless quirks. Lauren had always spoken in absolutes, what successful people did, how ambitious partners behaved, why certain traits were unacceptable, and I'd admired her certainty because I lacked it myself at the time. Back then, her confidence felt like guidance. Now, I recognized it as something closer to governance. I saw how often she framed her preferences as universal truths and how quickly she dismissed my perspectives when they didn't align with her worldview. None of it had seemed abusive or dramatic, which made it harder to name, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. Love had gradually turned into a conditional contract, and I had been renegotiating my value clause by clause without ever questioning the premise. The moment of reckoning came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that usually passed without significance. Lauren was sitting on the couch reviewing emails on her tablet, and I asked if we could talk. She looked up, mildly impatient but agreeable, already assuming the conversation would be about timelines or commitments to the list. I sat across from her, steady and deliberate, and told her I'd read the list carefully and taken it seriously. I watched relief wash over her face, followed quickly by satisfaction, as if order had been restored. Then I told her I'd made my own list in response, not written down, but clear in my mind. That got her attention. She straightened slightly, curiosity overtaking confidence, unprepared for the direction the conversation was about to take. I told her that my list had only one item on it, and that item was respect. I explained that I was willing to grow, to evolve, and to challenge myself, but not under the assumption that I was inherently lacking or needed to earn my place beside her. I said I wouldn't accept love framed as a reward for compliance, or marriage treated like a performance review with shifting benchmarks. I told her plainly that if she believed I needed fixing to deserve her, then she had already decided I wasn't her equal, and no amount of self-improvement on my part would change that imbalance. As I spoke, I felt something unlock inside me, not anger, not bitterness, but a clarity that made every word feel inevitable rather than rehearsed. Lauren stared at me in stunned silence, her usual rapid-fire responses nowhere to be found. When she finally spoke, she accused me of being defensive, of rejecting feedback, of refusing to grow. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I told her calmly that growth chosen freely was different from growth demanded under threat of disapproval. I said I loved who I was becoming, but I didn't love who I was when I constantly felt evaluated by the person who was supposed to be my partner. Then I delivered the answer she never expected. I told her I wouldn't be working through her list, because I no longer believed in the premise behind it. I said that if she needed a man she could shape and measure to feel secure, then I wasn't the right man for her, and I was finally at peace with that truth. The room fell quiet in a way that felt final, not dramatic, but decisive. Lauren didn't cry or yell, she looked confused, as if a system she'd relied on had suddenly stopped responding. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a strategy ready. I stood up, not to leave immediately, but to signal that something fundamental had shifted. In that moment, I understood that my answer wasn't about winning an argument or asserting dominance. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own worth. Whether our marriage survived that conversation was no longer the question that mattered most. What mattered was that I had finally spoken from a place of self-respect, and once that door opens, it never fully closes again. The days after that conversation felt strangely suspended, as if time itself had slowed to observe the shift that had taken place inside our marriage. Lauren didn't bring up the list again, not directly, but its absence was louder than its presence had ever been. She moved through the apartment with a cautious energy, no longer confident in her authority, no longer certain I would automatically bend to her expectations. We still spoke about logistics, work schedules, meals, small responsibilities, but the ease we once pretended to have was gone. I noticed how often she studied my face now, as if searching for the old version of me, the one who absorbed critique quietly and turned it into action without resistance. That man wasn't gone out of spite or rebellion, he was gone because he finally understood that peace bought at the cost of dignity is never peace at all. What unsettled Lauren most, I think, was that I didn't replace submission with aggression. I didn't raise my voice, issue ultimatums, or demand apologies. Instead, I became steady in a way she wasn't prepared for, unmoved by passive remarks or subtle attempts to reassert control. When she made comments framed as concern about my ambition or mindset, I acknowledged them politely without internalizing them. When she hinted that other men were more driven, more refined, more impressive, I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply said that comparison had never improved a relationship built on respect. Each response seemed to disarm her further, because there was nothing to push against. I wasn't fighting her, I was standing still, and that unnerved her more than any confrontation ever could. During that period, I began spending more time outside the house, not to avoid her, but to reconnect with parts of myself I'd neglected. I met old friends for coffee, returned to hobbies I'd quietly set aside because they didn't align with her definition of productivity, and took long walks where I let my thoughts settle without judgment. In those moments, I realized how much space I'd surrendered over the years, how subtly my world had shrunk around someone else's expectations. I wasn't rediscovering who I was reclaiming what had always been there, waiting patiently beneath layers of accommodation. The more grounded I felt, the clearer it became that my answer to the list had been less about her and more about honoring myself. Lauren eventually tried to revisit the conversation, framing it as a misunderstanding rather than a belief. One evening, she told me she only wanted the best for us, that her intentions had been misinterpreted, that the list was meant to motivate rather than diminish. I listened carefully, not because I needed convincing, but because I wanted to be fair. When she finished, I told her I believed her intentions might not have been cruel, but intentions didn't erase impact. I explained that love expressed through constant evaluation, even when wrapped in concern, erodes trust and safety over time. I asked her whether she truly saw me as her equal, or as someone perpetually in need of refinement. The question hung between us, unanswered, and that silence spoke more clearly than any defense could have. That was when I understood something important: not all relationships end with explosions. Some unravel quietly, thread by thread, when one person outgrows the role they were assigned. Lauren wasn't a villain, and I wasn't a martyr. We were two people operating under incompatible definitions of partnership, and mine had finally shifted. I no longer wanted to be loved for potential, for what I could become if I adjusted enough variables. I wanted to be chosen for who I already was, with growth as a shared journey rather than a requirement imposed from above. Once that truth settled in my chest, it brought with it a calm certainty that felt irreversible. The apartment felt different after that, not hostile, but temporary, like a place we were both passing through rather than building within. I started to imagine a future not defined by constant self-correction, where my worth wasn't up for negotiation or review. That future didn't yet have clear details, but it had something far more important: space. Space to speak without filtering, to choose without justification, to rest without guilt. As I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling beside the woman who had once felt like my partner and now felt like a mirror reflecting what I refused to be, I knew the hardest part wasn't ahead of me. The hardest part had been believing I needed to earn love at all. Now that belief was gone, and whatever came next would be built on something far more solid. The decision didn't arrive with drama or finality, it settled into me gradually, like a truth my body accepted before my mind fully caught up. I realized I was no longer trying to figure out how to fix the marriage, because the version of it that required fixing was the version that depended on my quiet compliance. I wasn't angry anymore, and that absence of anger told me everything. Anger would have meant I still wanted her to understand, still hoped she might change if I explained myself better. What I felt instead was a steady resolve, the kind that forms when you stop negotiating with reality. I understood that staying wouldn't make me more patient or evolved, it would make me smaller. And once you recognize shrinkage happening in real time, choosing yourself stops feeling selfish and starts feeling necessary. I told Lauren I needed space, not as a tactic or threat, but as a boundary. The word seemed to confuse her more than anything else I'd said in months. She asked how much space, for how long, what rules would apply, already trying to structure the separation into something manageable and conditional. I told her I didn't know yet, and that answer frustrated her because it couldn't be optimized or controlled. I packed a bag that night, deliberately and without urgency, taking only what I needed rather than what I was entitled to. As I zipped it closed, I felt a surprising sense of relief, not because I was escaping something terrible, but because I was finally honoring a discomfort I'd ignored for too long. Leaving didn't feel like failure, it felt like alignment. Living on my own again was quieter than I expected, but the silence wasn't empty, it was restorative. Without constant evaluation in the background, my thoughts returned to their natural rhythm. I woke up without bracing myself for judgment, made decisions without anticipating critique, and noticed how much energy that freed up. I didn't suddenly become a different man, I became a clearer one. I performed better at work, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because my focus was no longer divided. Friends commented that I seemed lighter, more present, and I realized how long I'd been carrying tension I'd mistaken for normal adulthood. The list had been gone for weeks, but its absence was finally being replaced by something better: self-trust. Lauren reached out often at first, her messages oscillating between conciliatory and defensive, reflection and justification. She told me she was willing to compromise now, that she'd gone too far, that maybe the list had been poorly worded. I read every message carefully, not with hope, but with discernment. What struck me wasn't what she said, but what she never quite acknowledged, that she had positioned herself as the judge of my worth, and that dynamic couldn't be undone with softer language. When I replied, I kept my words respectful and honest. I told her I appreciated the reflection, but I wasn't interested in renegotiating a version of love that required me to diminish myself to maintain harmony. That clarity, once spoken, felt like a line I could never cross back over. The final conversation happened weeks later, face to face, calm and almost gentle. We sat across from each other in a neutral space, no longer adversaries but no longer partners either. Lauren asked me if I really believed she'd never loved me, and I told her I believed she loved me in the way she knew how, which was structured, aspirational, and conditional. I told her that kind of love wasn't wrong, but it wasn't compatible with who I was becoming. I needed partnership, not assessment, encouragement, not evaluation. She listened quietly, and for the first time, she didn't argue. That silence wasn't surrender, it was understanding. And in that moment, I knew we were finished, not because one of us had won, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand without being reshaped. Walking away from the marriage wasn't the end of my growth, it was the beginning of a different kind of responsibility. I became accountable not to someone else's expectations, but to my own values. I learned that self-respect isn't loud or dramatic, it's consistent. It shows up in the choices you make when no one is watching, in the standards you refuse to compromise even when compromise would be easier. The list that once made me feel small had done something unexpected, it forced me to confront the cost of silence. And in answering it, not with counterarguments, but with boundaries, I found a voice I didn't know I'd lost. Whatever came next, I knew it would be built on that voice, steady and unapologetic, finally my own. The months after the separation unfolded without spectacle, but they reshaped me more profoundly than any dramatic confrontation ever could have. I finalized the divorce with the same calm intentionality that had guided every decision since the list appeared, refusing to let bitterness dictate the terms of my future. There were moments of sadness, of course, usually in quiet places when memories surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer carried confusion or self-doubt with them. I didn't wonder what I could have done differently to deserve better treatment, because that question had lost its power over me. Instead, I asked a better one: how do I want my life to feel when no one is grading my performance? That question became my compass, guiding me toward choices rooted in authenticity rather than approval. As my life settled into its new shape, I began to notice how differently I moved through the world. Conversations felt easier because I no longer measured every word for impact or correctness. Decisions came faster because I trusted my judgment instead of anticipating critique. Even failure, when it happened, felt cleaner, mine to own, mine to learn from, not evidence of some deeper inadequacy. At work, I took on challenges that genuinely interested me rather than those that looked impressive from the outside, and the irony wasn't lost on me when that authenticity led to better results anyway. Without trying to prove my worth, I became more effective, more confident, and more at peace than I had been in years. It turned out that freedom wasn't found in becoming better, but in becoming honest. People occasionally asked what happened between Lauren and me, especially those who'd seen us as the ideal, driven couple. I never told the story with resentment or drama. I simply said we wanted different kinds of partnerships, and that I had learned something important about self-respect. The truth was, I didn't need anyone else to validate my decision anymore. The list that once reduced me to bullet points had inadvertently clarified something essential: love that requires you to shrink, perform, or constantly self-correct isn't love, it's management. And I had no interest in living the rest of my life under management. That realization changed how I showed up in every relationship afterward, romantic or otherwise, because I stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy and expectations for care. When I eventually began dating again, it was with a patience and discernment I'd never practiced before. I paid attention to how conversations made me feel, not just how impressive they sounded. I noticed whether curiosity went both ways, whether disagreement was met with respect instead of correction, whether affection felt freely given rather than strategically withheld. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was auditioning for a role in someone else's vision of success. I was simply present, grounded in who I was, open to connection without needing it to complete or improve me. And that made all the difference. Love, I learned, isn't about becoming worthy, it's about being seen without having to edit yourself into someone more acceptable. Sometimes I think back to that moment at the dining table, the list slid toward me with quiet confidence, and I feel a strange sense of gratitude. Not for the disrespect, but for the clarity it forced upon me. That list ended a marriage, but it also ended a long-standing habit of self-erasure. My answer didn't leave her speechless because it was clever or cutting, it left her speechless because it broke a dynamic she'd assumed was permanent. I chose myself without apology, and in doing so, I reclaimed a life I no longer had to earn. And that, more than anything, is the ending that finally feels right. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.